grouping. Uh, um, Now, what I'm going to try and do is cover a fairly ambitious target, which is to discuss the history of law from the year 2000 BC until now. So we're just looking at 4,000 years of history. And in order to make that comprehensible, I will divide up the discussion into 5 peaks. That is, a peak in 1732 BC, which is the Hammurabi Code. And secondly, a peak with Roman law in 533 AD. And then I rush through history to AD 1830, when the population of the world first reached 1 billion. Then I proceed to 1968, when a great cultural revolution took place in the West. And then finally, today. So that's 5 peaks. That's to give the thing a bit of shape. And from a preliminary point of view, it's worth remembering a number of things about this huge span of history. The first is that for 90% of these 4,000 years, human beings and humanity were engaged in agriculture. And the law which took place was very focused on the agricultural pastimes. And most of the merchant and commercial and contract law grew only up in the towns and cities. So a very small portion of the law, which is very much orientated towards things like family law and succession law. The second thing is the population in most of history were illiterate. So luckily for them, they didn't have to read any legal textbooks, and they weren't really able to study what the law was. So that made things rather difficult, for the lawyers and the rulers. Then thirdly, the infrastructure of law, like courts and bailiffs and law enforcement and judges and academics and so on, were really absolutely tiny and non-existent in most countries until fairly recently, last couple of 100 years, And then finally, we must never underestimate the importance of land. It was important throughout history, and it still is. Now, in terms of history, the way I look at history is to try and bring it closer to us. So I measure history in terms of lives of 70 years each. And if you lay them end to end, so 70 years, 70 years, 70 years from now, starting with, say, Picasso or something like that, you get back to Copernicus, the Polish scientist who was the first to say, actually, I think we're going round the sun, not the other way around. You get back to him in 7 lives, which is not that far. And you get back to the Buddha and Confucius in 35 lives, which again is not that far. You can sort of almost touch them if you stretch out like this. And if you put yourself in a long line, it would really just be one side of a fairly long table, to dinner or something like that. So the past I see as being really close to us. And also the past is a kind of mirror of what was happening over all of these years. And so if we trace law closely in the detail, which unfortunately I can't do, you will find that the law reflects what is happening to societies as it proceeds through the centuries. So first, let's just start 1732 BC with King Hammurabi. He was king of the New Babylonians, and he was quite a warlord. His conquests were impressive, but he's famous for a code which he had carved onto a stele of granite. It's like a great slab of granite. It's got 272 articles, and you can actually see his laws in the Louvre Museum in Paris. So it's quite a big thing, and it's got 272 articles on it. And he insisted at the end that nobody was ever to change his laws. They were immutable and unchangeable, which I'm afraid is not the situation at present, because law is very, very volatile. And the extraordinary thing about this code was how it dealt with everything. Of course, he dealt, with family, crime, land, but he also dealt with tavern keepers and maritime law, and with a number of professions as well. And so it was, in a way, the law influenced by a town as well as agriculture. And to me, it's incredibly precocious because there was absolutely nothing like that, except we do know that there was a code of about 2380 BC, 2380 BC, called the Code of Uruk-Gagina. We know of it. I think it was quite short because we've got references to it. So the Babylonians were absolutely incredible in what they achieved. And for some reason, it never took hold on what happens after that. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Because the next time when something amazing happens with the law is with the Roman Empire. And fun enough, it wasn't the Roman Empire who actually compiled their laws. It was compiled in Constantinople by Justinian and his team. He had a team of 16 lawyers under a jurist called Tribonian. And in 3 years, they assembled a massive compilation of Roman law since right back to the beginning, although most of it was formed after about 200 AD. So that appeared in 533 AD. And again, it was incredibly ahead of its time because it wasn't just about family law and crime. It also was a commercial system of law because, of course, Rome was based on this huge city. It was a huge city in those days. And so they were very much involved in commerce. So now that compilation of law then sort of disappeared from the West. And it only resurfaced a bit later, about 1080 or thereabouts, in Pisa. And it was discovered, and then it was the original compilations arrived in the University of Bologna under a professor called Inerius. And he was fascinated by this, and he studied it, and it was then carried across the University of Paris and the University of Oxford, with great centers of learning at the time. And that code was studied for about 400 years, all the way through to the end of the medieval era, through to the Renaissance, by scholars. They were called glossators, commentators. And it wasn't applied at all until much later, 1700, It was just a sort of academic subject. And they spent all those centuries just trying to understand it because it was so removed from anything they had ever seen before. So it's much larger in terms of law than the whole of the Judaic Torah, the Christian New Testament, and the Muslim Quran put together. And I'll come back to that. Now, in the rest of the world, just to try and see what's happening in the rest of the world, Europe was in its dark ages, and notwithstanding the revisionists of history, they were a dark age. They only woke up in about 1000 AD, 1100, something like that. But at the same time, you had the Umayyads in Arabia, you had the Gupta in India, and the Tang in China. Now, the Tang were really interesting because they were a fantastic civilization. They were around roughly at the same time as the ending of the Roman Empire in 476, a bit later than that. And they put together a criminal code in 653. And that was largely based on the Sui and Han codes, but they extended it. And it was that code which lasted all the way through to the fall of the empire in 1911. It was adjusted a bit, but not much. And it was basically a list of crimes and punishments. So it was a basic sort of criminal code. And to me, it's astonishing that something like that should last so long. And it's a big question also as to what happened to Chinese commercial law in the meantime. We do know that at the time of the Song, there were enormous advances, you know, the invention of gunpowder and printing and all of this, much celebrated in Chinese history. And then everything got wiped out when Kublai Khan appeared. And then there was a resurgence, a kind of a renaissance going on at the beginning of the Ming, with all of the journeys of Admiral Cheng, for example, which was snuffed out. I don't quite know what the date was, maybe around about 1500, by an isolationist policy by the Ming. And that isolationist policy more or less seemed to shut down extensive legal developments in the commercial sense until much later. But to me, this is a question because I don't know. I really don't know what happened to commercial law in China from the isolation of the Ming through to 1911. I know what happened after 1911, but until then, to me, it's a bit of a vacuum, a blank. And the same thing happened in Japan, which had a feudal system, but then under the Tokugawa, they did the same thing. They retreated, they were isolated until the 1867 Meiji Restoration, when they began to borrow at a great rate from Western European models. So that sort of means that the whole trajectory of what the Romans were doing, started by Hammurabi, didn't include, so far as I can see from my research so far, didn't really include China and didn't really include Japan, although there were lots of developments between Europe and in Asia generally, which we'll come on to. Now, I just want to deal for a moment with the great religions. The main legacy of Rome were its laws and its religion. And both of these were actually passed on to future generations, not by the Romans themselves, but the laws by Constantinople, Byzantium, and the religion by a tiny little province in the Middle East, Christianity. And although their legacy of Christianity has secularized quite a lot over the years, their legal system, the other legacy they left, has not. It has triumphed, as I'll show you in a moment. So to me, that's an extraordinary reflection on what's been happening in history over all of these past years. The thing about Christianity, it had a very low legal content, and there are reasons for that. And also, the Quran had a much higher legal content, but not all that much. The legal content came later, in the 700s and 800s, in the development of Sharia law into 4 different schools, but quite early, 200 or 300 years after the Romans. And the key point about the development of the Sharia law was the actual expanse of it was huge. First of all, the Arabs themselves, in one of the most biggest surprises in history, burst out of the Arabian Peninsula and basically conquered everywhere from, they got as far as Poitiers in France in 732 AD, and they got all the way through to India, and it was spread further to countries like Indonesia. So really they had the whole expanse of that enormous portion of the world, except the peripheries, Australia, they didn't have that, and they didn't have the Americas, obviously. So they really had the whole of the world under the rule of their law, Sharia law, as they had developed it in the 800s and 900s. And then it seemed to fade a bit. And there were revolutions and empires rising and falling in the meantime. But from 1200 onwards, the Mongols appeared. And they did more or less the same thing as the Arabs had done, except bigger. They were swept all the way through to Europe on one side, and then all the way through to China on the other, including taking over China under Kublai Khan. And at that point, they were just Mongols. They were really rough people, absolutely terrifying, quite brutal. And it was only later that under the Khanate that they were converted to Islam. And so they were highly influential in the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals in India, and they were highly influential in Iran and all across the North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. So what seems to have happened was that while Christianity was secularizing and fading from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment onwards, to be honest, canon law was very much out of touch with the secular rulers. Sharia law was in fact dominant even to the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s. And so that's just a huge historical development of, I think, of great importance to the law. So you can actually see that a legal system which was invented in the late 600s lasted all the way through to the 1920s and still is very important. But a lesser number of countries are strict Sharia law. Another incredible example of the reach of a particular country like Rome over the whole known world. Sort of incredible reflection to me on how powerful the law can be when somebody does it well, as they did, and how indelible it is on centuries ahead. Now, the third peak is in 1830. I'm taking a big leap forward because I think I can actually, because I think I've sort of dealt with the Romans and then I've dealt with what's happened roughly in the rest of the world. I pass over the Renaissance because I know quite a lot's happened in the Renaissance in Europe, but nothing like what happened in 1830. And I choose the year 1830. I mean the decades around 1830, 30 or 40 years either side of 1830, because that's when the population of the world hit the first billion. And until then, it had been really, running along at the bottom. At the time of the Romans, about 200 million, and was very small at the time of Hammurabi. He was dealing with an extremely small population at the time, maybe 100 million, something like that. So 1830 was a big year, and it took another century for the population of the world in 1930 to reach the second billion, and then it accelerated so that now it catches up a million in about 10 years or so. We're now up to 8 billion. And so that in itself was an immense moment for human nature, because that increase in the population, since you had so many more people, I mean, I think it's quite simple in a way. They invented a lot of things because there were more of them. They accumulated, so they invented steam power, electricity, transport, communication, so on. And the Industrial Revolution that took place, which began to erode the hold of agriculture. So now agriculture in many countries is only 1 or 2% of the GDP, certainly of the developed countries. And that's also led to an absolutely huge expansion of the law. I mean, vast. Banks were really, I know everybody had banks way back to Lydia, but banks really came into their own at that time. And so did corporations. Corporations were a new invention. The Romans didn't have corporations, they had partnerships, which were very inadequate. Of course, there were a few other corporations like the Dutch East India Company and so on, but basically the corporations started then. And the key point about banks and corporations is that when you switch the light on, the light comes on. Why does it come on? Because there's a power station. Why is there a power station? Because it's been financed. Who's financed it? Well, banks have provided the finance, and corporations have been the vehicles for building the project. But who finances the corporations and the banks? Well, the people. Because if you trace it back, if you lift all of these creatures of the legal imagination who are just a mark in a corporate book, the money they use comes from the people. So those inventions, the banks and the corporations, were actually just representatives of the people's money. The money they got was the product of the work and labor of the people. It doesn't come from heaven or anything like that. It was the work and labor of the people. So who switches on the lights? The people switch it on. So that's how you can understand, because these vehicles provided the means of pooling the savings of the people, so it could be used to switch on the lights or whatever other infrastructure. That's just a symbol. So both of those were legal inventions. They were inventions of the legal mind, and they were at the root of the immense growth which we've had in the world since that period. And that was in the law, it meant a lot of other things happened at the same time. You had the beginnings of democracies and people power all began then. There was a move away from very harsh criminal punishments. You had a development of maritime law because of ships and transport, which led to a lot of conflicts of law. So you had the development of governing law, the rule of the governing law. You could choose the governing law freely and courts, and you had an arbitration developing as an escape from the courts. So that was a big moment, and that's my third peak. So far, we've had Hammurabi, then the Romans, and then the 1830 peak. And so that takes me through to the fourth peak, which is 1968. And the 1968 revolution was much more complicated to fit into history. It was mainly a revolution in the West, and it was a cultural revolution. It led to the rise of feminism, and it led also to the removal of the patriarchal old model, where there was a patriarch in charge of the family who called the shots. It led to the rise of the women's movement, and it was also a sexual revolution, which has brought about beginning of the declines of the family in the West, not anywhere else. It was only in the West that this happened. And that also, because of the importance of democracies, voters, you also had the rise of the regulated states because of the science. You had the rise of the welfare state and very high taxation in the West. And you had the rise of insolvency rescue laws to protect debtors against insolvency. A whole host of things happened round about the time, including a very large increase in sovereign insolvency. So that by the time you got through to about 1983 or so, about 40% of the world's countries were insolvent and had to be rescued. And at the same time, there was an absolutely massive increase in the amount of law. I mean, I don't know how much it is. I don't know whether it was 10,000 since 1830, 10,000, 100,000, a million. I really don't know. If you look at the tax code in the US of about 1840, I think it was only about 8 or 10 pages or something like that. But look at it now, absolutely vast. And if you look at regulatory law, all these regulated fields, I don't know how many they are, but regulatory law, which is everything from competition law to health and safety to pharmaceuticals to building regulations to planning for rules for how you, for land, it's vast. It's a behemoth. It's a leviathan. One of the biggest areas, domains of law, which sits very uneasily between the criminal law and ordinary tort law. It's a state-backed system of law, and it has got a punitive element attached to it in terms of fines, but it doesn't have all the criminal protections. So that's and I don't really need to say much now about the present, because I think we all know the present. There's a lot of confusion in the world, some of it quite dangerous, lots of conflicts. And what is holding up reasonably, well, what is not working in legal terms? I don't believe that the criminal law is working very well. I think I don't think there's anything wrong with the criminal law. I mean, people will criticize bits of it, say this is too harsh or it's too soft. Everybody's got a view about that. But it's the compliance rate of humanity is not all that good. There are a lot of fairly minor but crimes which have a great effect on the population to which it's served, like cybercrime. And there's an enormous amount of corruption going on at governmental level in many countries. And so I think the criminal law leaves a lot to be desired, not in terms of what the law says, but in terms of what we as human beings are actually making of it. And the second area of law, which had a very bright development when it was rediscovered in the first by Grotius way back in the 17th century, and then beginning to find its feet after the First World War, and then very much so in 1946 with the United Nations Charter, and is now an enormous and complicated system, public international law. That, despite all of the efforts, is not working. So if you look at the other domains of law, which in my opinion are working, I think that corporate laws working fairly well. Um, of course, people, some people regard all corporations being predatory. I don't quite go along with that idea. But in terms of contract law, the number of contracts which are made every day must be something like 2 or 3 billion. If you've got 8 billion people and some of them are buying a loaf of bread or some eggs every day, I mean, that would be 8 billion contracts. So a vast number of contracts are being made. A lot of them just disappear almost within minutes or seconds. But every time a contract is made, buying a loaf of bread, the huge law of contract sweeps into place. And so I think in legal terms, that has been a real success story. And I think corporations also, in terms of what they're supposed to do, I think that has been another success story. And I also think that those two areas of law, which is commercial law, are holding up against the strains. Of course, there's lots of fraying at the edges, fragmentation, a lot of things going wrong. But on the whole, those legal institutions have been a triumph of the legal mind, in my view. And so the others which still need to be, I think progress needs to be made, I've already mentioned. So, if you say, well, what is that? What is all this really about? Well, what has happened, and which is very clear to me now, is that, as Patrick said earlier, the law is now the basis of our society. You can't have a society without a legal system. I mean, how would you have taxation if you had no laws at all? I mean, a lot of people, including me, would not pay the taxes at the rate we have. And so you wouldn't be able to finance the state, even the most basic level. How would we resolve all the arguments, except by some means of having a constitutional powers of one sort or another, whether democracy or whatever kind of government, which actually compels people to observe a system of rules. The laws of the world, for all of their faults, are now a code of conduct. What is the purpose of the code of conduct? To stop the fighting. Why we want to stop the fighting? Because we want to survive. I mean, we want to survive individually, of course. The idea that we can't make any advances if we have fighting all the time. And also, we as humanity also want to survive. I know many people say, oh, well, look what a myth we've made, of the planet. But I don't go for that either. I haven't met anybody who would be very happy if you said, by next September, we're all going to be dead. I don't think many people would be all too pleased by that. So what has happened since the Romans and Hammurabi, who started all this, is that the laws are now an ideology. They're bigger than us. They are by far the biggest codes of conduct we've got. Some are very moral, like tax is moral. It's a form of compulsory charity, if you like. Everything is suffused and drenched by some kind of moral view. Some of it's just utilitarian, like what side of the street you drive on and the stoplights and things like that. It doesn't really matter what the laws are about, but they are the means to me, of survival. And I believe that being what we are, which could be a miracle, we have a duty to survive. So I hope that's some help. Maybe, Patrick, we can just flick through the slides, and I won't comment in particular on them because I think they got an obvious mess. So if you would start at the rec of the...
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna put them up. Wow. Yeah. God, they're there. It's always a miracle, I think. And there's that picture I took of Philip, which I'm very proud of. And I think I'm going to have to manipulate these. So, Philip, tell me what you want. But there's the picture I took of Philip at the
Can you show
National
Liberty
Gallery.
first? Okay, next one.
Okay, that's it. Okay.
Right, this is a very famous picture in the Louvre, 1848. It's a picture of liberty. They're all fully armed. They've obviously got something on their mind. At that time, it was about political liberty, but it's also an allegory for the law. The law restricts us, and is she right that she's fighting for liberty? Because the law is a restriction. And I would say that we have to have restriction in order to have liberty. Next one. This is the wreck of the Medusa, 1816. 147 people got on the raft. The ship was wrecked at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in June off the coast of Mauritania. 147 people on the raft and 15 got off after, I think, about 10 days out there. And practically everybody on that raft was killed by the fighting for the brandy and the biscuits. Next one. This is the Chilean mine. 2010, I think it was, when some 30 Chilean miners were locked down in a mine which subsided and collapsed on them. They were down there for a long time, 60 days, something like that, and they all got out. Now, the message to me of that, of the wreck of the Medusa, compared where practically everybody was killed, and the Chilean mine, is the Chilean miners, the first thing they did was to say, now, let's just check how much food we've got. And they also said, we need a leader. So they appointed one of the miners, who happened to be the oldest miner, and he made rules about the food and how they survived. They actually played dominoes most of the time, and they all got out. So what's the lesson of that? That the Chilean miners had a legal system, very primitive, but they had a constitution and they had rules. They made a legal system and they survived. We're on Medusa, they didn't have a legal system. They just fought, and the captain had left the ship. So that was the difference. So the law is for survival. Next one. I show you this. This is population. You see the purple line. You can see how it suddenly, right at the bottom, it's the pink line, population. You can see how it goes up around about 1830 suddenly. And also GDP races up as well, and the amount of law completely takes off. So that's what that illustrates. And the result we've got now is the next slide. It's this. This is these are the jurisdictions of the world, and basically I put them into classes. The three biggest class are the English common law, the Napoleonic, which is in blue, and also the United States in dark blue, the Napoleonic system, which is in yellow, and what I call the Roman Germanic system, which is based on Germany and Holland, which is in light green. And then I have a mixed systems, which are like China and the Southern African Cone, Scotland and Quebec and Panama, a strange group, and Japan, which are mixtures of civil and common law. And then and those groups between them are at the basis of nearly 90% of the world's jurisdictions, those systems. That's because of borrowings, which partly because of imperialism, but more than half because of the borrowings of law, which is still going on around the world following independence in many countries. So of the 320 jurisdictions, the percentages are about 40% Anglo-American common law, about 30% Napoleonic, and about 20% Roman Germanic, and the other two are Islamic and transition jurisdictions like Vietnam and so on. So that again shows that when we talk about the law, we're not talking about some nationalistic, cultural, local thing. We're talking about ideologies. And so we have got these three different ideologies. They're quite different. And they all, in one way or another, came out of the work of Hammurabi and his lawyers, and also the Romans. So I think that's an interesting picture which you can put on your mats, for your computer or your T-shirts or whatever. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. Thank you very much, everyone.